Ambassador, you've been involved for a number of years also, advising the Italian government on economic matters. What are you hearing in terms of soft versus hard Brexit? It seems unclear, right? If you're German and you want red lines, that we will get anything but a hard Brexit.
So I hear around here in London, of course, we would like to see the closest possible ties between the EU and UK. I know that Italian investors, like Japanese investors, at the moment are putting on hold further investments because they want clarity, they want to understand what the future relationship between the Union and the UK will be. Of course, it's for this country, for this government to take a decision. We respect any decision that will be taken, as we respect the decision taken with the referendum. But it is obvious, and Prime Minister Renzi said this to the BBC yesterday, that we hope there will be a very close relationship, but you can't have the rights of a member of the Union with the duties of a third country. So there must be, of course, a balance between rights and duties.
And Jared, you were economic advisor for many years to Boris Johnson. I mean, again, what's the thinking within, on his side?
Well, I haven't advised Boris since I stopped being at City Hall in early May.
But you know his thinking.
But, regardless of that, I think the key way to look at this is in economic and financial terms as well as in political terms. I think the terminology hard versus soft Brexit doesn't really help anyone. The way I would call it, the choice is between a clean versus a messy Brexit. A clean Brexit is a clean break, and the politics very much comes in there as well as the economics, because a clean Brexit means a focus on sovereignty, a focus on migration, and an acceptance that at the end of the 2-year period you're outside the single market.
Let's not call it soft or hard. Let's call it access to the single market with passporting or not.
OK, well, in terms of access to the single market, that's different to being in the single market. With a clean Brexit, you take the view that you're outside the single market in terms of your default position, and then once you trigger Article 50, it's up to you if you want, and politicians seem to want to negotiate. If you go for the other option, what you have to bear in mind, as the ambassador touched on, you have the reality that you have to depend on the other 27 countries and on the European Commission. What the UK needs is a clarity about its own position, and then a bespoke deal on top of that if it so wishes. So it's about access to the single market. And of course, you need to be realistic and pragmatic, because the auto sector, the city, lots of other different parts of the economy have their own positions, and naturally are putting those forward at the moment.
And it seems very clear, the position for the EU at the moment is red lines. So if you don't give in on immigration, then we renegotiate completely. What exactly do we know is the position of the UK government at the moment?
Well, we're not at all sure. I mean, what we know is that they've tried to play what I think is a very dangerous game by, for example, not saying anything about the European residents that are here now. And that's very unfair both on people living and working in the UK and on the member states. And so they're obviously holding EU nationals here to hostage, if you like. So there's a hard kind of approach behind what we're hearing from the Prime Minister, and I think it's disastrous. I think it's utterly disastrous. And I think that...
How would you fix it?
How would we fix it? I mean, to be honest, what I think is we should begin negotiations and see where we get to, and then we should go to Parliament and we should debate it fully. And then when we have the outcome and we understand the implications fully, when the public understands the implications, my view is we should go back to the public and tell them what we've negotiated and whether or not they approve.
Ambassador, I mean, there are hundreds of companies, Italian companies, invested in the UK. There are hundreds of thousands of Italians living in the UK. How do you reassure them? Or can you reassure them, given that we don't exactly know the position of anyone at the moment?
Well, I don't think that any government here in the UK would be ready to send back a couple of million of European citizens. So I think that the rights will be respected. Of course, this is different when it comes to the future. We don't know what will be the possibility for other Italians if they want to come and settle here. But of course, there is a connection between the single market and the freedom of movement. our investors would like to see the UK in the single market, and of course our citizens would like to retain freedom of movement. But regarding this, I wonder whether, since it's all about taking back control, if control has been exercised to the complete potential which is offered by current EU regulations. If you read what maybe few people did, if you read the EU Directive 38 of 2004, it tells you that you can send back EU citizens if after 3 months they are out of work or without a concrete perspective of getting a work. Now, what is the problem is that, of course, to implement this directive, you need registration.
Right.
So you need to accept the idea of registration. Many people tell me, oh, this is un-British. But then, if you speak about taking back control, you must accept that you need tools, national tools, to exercise that control. And EU already gives you part of those tools, at least.
Look, in terms of the broader debate, I agree with what Anne was saying about the nationals, EU nationals, but I think we should respect those. But 3 into 2 doesn't go, or it doesn't go easily. There are 3 big issues: sovereignty, migration, and single market. If you want to have control of sovereignty and you want to have control of migration, that doesn't mean no migration, it means low migration, then you have to be outside the single market. And that's the starting position as such. Now, it's likely, I would imagine this weekend or the next few days, the Prime Minister might well, given that the Conservatives have their party conference, announce some clarity, not about the detail, but about the timing. Because I do think Article 50 needs to be enacted sometime in the first half next year. And I think the real big disappointment is the previous Chancellor and Prime Minister didn't do any preparatory work.
Fine.
The Bank of England should be given lots of credit because they prepared for all eventualities, and hence they've responded in a sensible way.
But because no one was expecting Brexit, right, on either side. Is that fair? But
No,
it's fair.
Not fair.
So why did we not have a plan B, Gerard?
So if you weren't prepared, why did you call the referendum?
Absolutely.
You know, the irresponsibility
Well, because
of
they
calling
thought
a
they'd win
referendum. No, but the irresponsibility of not preparing for an outcome like this is unbelievable and long term. I mean, this will be one of the most damaging legacies a Prime Minister has ever left to this country. You know, so it's extremely disturbing that we don't have civil service capacity, that we cut back on the civil service, and now we're having to massively expand the civil service. I think we'll find fiscal expansion becomes very fashionable in Britain again,
and necessary,
and very necessary.
And Gerard, I want to ask you how you model it, but first to the ambassador. What will Europe become from now on? Is there more integration? Is there a push from European leaders to say, right, well, Brexit happened, so we need to be stronger together, or actually will it cool off? Will it be a Europe that learns lessons from Brexit and starts reforming?
Well, all the possibilities are open, can be either way, but we hope that this will help to focus the politicians' mind to try to single out what are the real preoccupations of the citizens, what are the real necessities. So instead of starting again talking on new architectures, new initiatives, one should really give a response to the need of security, which is really coming from.
And this is what we're going to
opinion.
see in the Italian elections in a few weeks' time. Not so. This is going to be the next shock, in my view.
I don't think. Sorry, I don't think will be a shock because, as I said, the President of the Republic is the ultimate decision maker regarding the future of a government, and I suspect that even if should the referendum be lost, he would, and we have elections anyhow in 18 months, so he would ask the Prime Minister to go on and the government to serve on until the next election. So I don't think there will be any political instability.
No, that might be the case, not to Italy, but to the European Union. It's another.
It's also maybe the perception. I mean, there is a clear. Matteo Renzi's, also backtracked on his initial saying referendum, and there's a perception, I guess, on the markets that it's the next hotspot. I don't know how to model things, Gerard. The problem when you look at, first of all, the pretty strong data that we've had since Brexit, and also so you want to call it, and I admire your British, stay calm and carry on, not call it hard or soft, but to what, messy and clean. But how do you model either?
Well, basically what we've seen in the last 3 months is that financial Armageddon and economic collapse, as was predicted by the bulk of the Remain side, as was predicted by former Chancellor George Osborne.
We
That's
have not triggered Article 50
No,
yet.
of course not. But
I'm just saying.
But hold on, but we have seen 3 months of clarity about the economy. Now, the reality, of course, is that the UK economy is at the stage of the economic cycle where normally we'd be slowing down regardless of Brexit. So therefore, the policy easing from the Bank of England was justified. I expected it. The weaker pound also was justified, and I expected that as well. And I think anyone who looks at the economy now, as Anne touched on earlier, we need to see a fiscal boost. So in terms of modelling it, there's a number of things. There's the economy, and then we need to have the transition in terms of Article 50.
And once
I think it's really wrong to suggest that actually we have to wait for the impact of this. We've already sterling the day before the vote, sterling was to the dollar was $1.50. Today it's $1.29. I've just come from New Zealand and from Brussels, and I tell you, life is now very much more expensive for Britons. We are poorer, considerably poorer than we were the day before this Brexit.
What's your main concern?
And it hasn't fed through yet into prices, but
so
it
you worry
will
about
feel
inflation?
into prices, and the impact will be effectively wage cuts. And that is coming through, and it's not very obvious, but every time a Brit goes into shop, they are going abroad. They are buying Hollywood movies, they are buying iPhones.
Because we import so much things in the UK.
There's a whole number of issues here. I'm sure Anne would agree with me that the current account deficit that was sizable, and indeed still is sizable, in my view suggested that the pound was overvalued, regardless of the Brexit vote. The Brexit vote, I think anyone who thought that there would be a leave vote would have anticipated not only a weaker pound, but also lower rates. But I think the weaker pound is justified. I think in terms of the economy, it's an imbalanced economy. The inflation feed-through is something that we do need to watch. And indeed, one of the big challenges, not just in Britain, but other countries, has been that wages have not really risen enough.
No, exactly.
And so that is an issue. But we do have
the pound fell after the crisis, and that made no difference whatsoever, it seems to me, to our export capacity. We did not improve our balance of payments.
I mean, we do see in retail sales it actually gave a little bit of a boost. But Ambassador, what's the number one question that you get? I mean, you must get, does Matteo Renzi call you and say, like, what exactly is going on? UK politics are strangely a lot like Italians in certain respects since the Brexit vote. It depends.
Well, there is anecdotal evidence that there are investments being put on hold. And so I'm worried for the medium-long-term consequences. Because when you reduce investments, then, of course, there is a contraction in the economy, inevitably. So for the time being, consumption is going well. So we are not seeing any negative results. But in the medium-long term, if there is not a solution which reassures the investors, you will see a contraction of investment and therefore consequences on the economy.
But do we have a timeline problem in that actually, even if we trigger Article 50, we don't know what traders, what access you have. At the same time, the investment you're talking about. I mean, CEOs need to choose in the next 12 months investments over the next 5 years. They can't just wait around.
There's a whole host of issues here, global as well as regional as well as domestic. If you actually decide to trigger Article 50 and at the same time get all of Whitehall to work to the assumption that the UK will leave the EU at the end of that period, then you start to remove some of the uncertainty. Now, clearly, there is then still a 2-year so-called negotiation. But the important point with a clean Brexit is you start to control your own destiny and you actually have a clear default, which is actually either trading freely.
I think that's really ambitious.
Right, do you control, and I think just one last question, then we do need to take a break. And I mean, you could push back in saying we control our own destiny in a world where everyone's looking inward. So actually, what really do you control when it comes to new trade agreements?
Well, in terms of trade... sorry, did you...
No, carry on, Joe.
I was going to say, in terms of trade agreements, we have to remember that the EU has been very regulatory-driven, very protectionist-driven. When you actually... Trade agreements are always there to protect certain sectors against other sectors. Now, therefore, when you try and get rid of the tariff wall around the EU, which we would outside, then that protects UK helps UK consumers. But in terms of a trade agreement, you have to do it against the backdrop where, in my view, you've already decided to leave the EU. Because there's no reason why all the 27 countries are going to agree to something unless we have a stronger bargaining position than just going in with open arms into any negotiation.
Yeah, I was thinking more about the US and even China. But and very quick comment, and then we'll come back to it.
I just think, that to be in control of our destiny when we have capital mobility, when investors can choose to leave tomorrow, is a little bit, illusory. And, we may well be able to negotiate trade deals, but that's a long way down the line. We're having to import New Zealanders to teach us how to do it. And in the meantime, capital is flowing out of this country. And that is a really big problem, given our current account deficit.
Ambassador, you're a master of diplomacy, a master of negotiation. How would you go, if you were the UK, how would you go into the 27 countries and try and get a better deal?
Well, I'll try to remember that in the end I need the agreement of the 27. So I would avoid trying to to divide the partners and play one against the other, because I would try to be constructive to get to an agreement which is acceptable for the 27. And from that point of view, this rhetoric that it is in your interest is not really helpful, I think.
Right.
You should accept our condition because you have, we have a trade deficit and so on. Because it doesn't take into consideration that the trade deficit, for example, it's only with a couple of countries, not with 27.
Right.
And again, there's been a lot of talking of undemocratic European Union, faceless bureaucrats and so on. But in the end, it is run with democratic principles, and you have to agree at 27. So maybe one country is enough to block an agreement. And and also, I wouldn't discount the possibility of emotional reactions. If you are bullied in a way, you could have, and in this country there was, after all, an emotional decision. So now it's a bit odd that they consider that on the other side everyone will be rational.